Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see the people in the room. Hopefully, everyone is learning a lot with these presentations so far by Imen. OECMs really are starting to get a lot of attention in the fisheries sector in particular, and I want to share with you why that is and how FAO is trying to get involved. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amber Harms-Cornell. I'm a fisheries officer in the FAO Fisheries and Aquaculture Division here in Rome, and the division's focal point on area-based management. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So I want to get started by looking at the connection between fisheries and biodiversity conservation. Fisheries has a really important role in conserving biodiversity. Ultimately, the fisheries and aquaculture sectors are very dependent on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Because of this, for decades, fisheries management and managers have been trying to make fisheries more sustainable so that they can contribute to biodiversity conservation, human well-being, food security, and livelihoods all at the same time. This is one of the reasons that Sustainable Development Goal 14 was adopted. Its main goal is to reconcile the sustainable use of fisheries resources, social equity, and economic development. In line with that were the Convention on Biological Diversity's Aichi Targets 6 and 11, and now their predecessor that is going to be turned into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is where OECMs come in. They were first conceived in Aichi Target 11, as Imen explained in her earlier presentation. The OECM concept represents a new opportunity for states to recognize biodiversity conservation potential from a wide range of spatial management measures than it has been seen before. OECM recognition provides states with an incentive to coordinate area-based fisheries management efforts across fisheries that take place within their exclusive economic zones, with area-based management tools being used in other sectors. In particular, the OECM concept allows the fisheries sector to contribute to meeting global biodiversity targets through their own area-based management initiatives. Creating networks of areas managed for conservation can result in more extensive coverage of conservation efforts. It also makes conservation a multi-sectoral effort. The fisheries sector provides additional protection for protected species and vulnerable habitats and recognizes many different governance types. By recognizing OECMs in the fisheries sector, we can have two significant steps forward in achieving biodiversity conservation. First, biodiversity conservation objectives can be mainstreamed into the management of fisheries resources. And second, we can ensure the objectives of the fisheries sector are included in biodiversity conservation discussions. Furthermore, it's important to emphasize that countries should be establishing MPAs and implementing initiatives that meet the OECM criteria in parallel if we're going to successfully conserve marine biodiversity. Next slide. So the big question is, do fisheries OECMs exist? And I would argue that the answer is yes, even though there hasn't been very much reporting of them. So far, there are only a few concrete examples. As Imen said, only Canada and the Philippines have reported marine OECMs, and only Canada has specifically reported fisheries sector OECMs. Many area-based fisheries management measures already aim to meet sustainability goals and are likely to meet the OECM criteria. Such measures are widely included in fisheries management plans and processes. And even those areas that do not meet the criteria, they might only need to have a few small changes, such as adding additional measures or restrictions, improving spatial integration, or increasing monitoring and reinforcement. Ultimately, the term OECM has caused considerable confusion, largely because parties did not develop and adopt official guidance early on for how to assess what could or could not be recognized as an OECM under Target 11. Next slide. As countries begin considering whether their fisheries sector has existing area-based fisheries management measures that could qualify as OECMs, there are a few key considerations to keep in mind. First is that area-based fisheries management measures have three main dimensions of constraint. They can be constrained in time, where areas are closed to fishing permanently, temporarily, seasonally, on a rotational basis, or in real time. They can be constrained in space, where areas are closed in the high seas, the entire exclusive economic zone, or all are a part of a fishing ground within an EEZ. And third, the types of fishing activities that can be controlled. For example, where there are limitations that apply to all fishing, some gears, some socioeconomic categories, such as large scale or small scale fishing. The degree of restriction in the three main dimensions leads to a large range of area-based fisheries management measures when combined with different potential purposes and contextual parameters related, for example, to oceanographic characteristics, governance regimes, the jurisdiction where they are located in, etc. Next slide, please. The next and arguably most important consideration are the types of biodiversity outcomes that the area has been documented to have, or that it's expected to have in the future. One way that we at FAO are trying to tackle this problem is by doing a large-scale literature review to identify existing area-based fisheries management where biodiversity outcomes have been reported. So far, we've found 471 individual case studies around the world, mostly in the peer-reviewed literature, of area-based fisheries management measures in countries where there are documented biodiversity outcomes that the areas have produced. What you see on this slide is a list of how we've categorized them so far. The biodiversity outcomes that have been identified for various types of areas range across species and populations, habitats, and ecosystem level outcomes. This is simply to make you aware of the multiple types of positive biodiversity outcomes that area-based fisheries management can produce. For the purposes of the Mediterranean, in this 471, we've actually discovered 42 separate area-based fisheries management measures that currently exist and that we're analyzing against the OECM criteria to see what the potential might be. What this literature review shows us is that while in some regions there are not a lot of areas that are already documented to have positive biodiversity outcomes, in the Mediterranean, there actually are lots of different areas that we can start looking at collectively against the biodiversity or the OECM criteria. Next slide. At FAO, we're working to try to promote the recognition and inclusion of OECMs in the fisheries sector, and we're prepared to provide support to FAO's members in the identification, assessment, reporting, and monitoring of OECMs as countries prepare to agree on increased commitments in the post-2020 framework. Our mandate started earlier this year when our members requested that we produce and disseminate practical guidance to support implementation of the OECM criteria. To do this, we've developed a program of work aimed at soliciting country expertise to help shape guidance for assessing fisheries OECMs, at the same time as applying the guidance in countries through using shared learning exchanges. Ultimately, we want to try to produce OECM guidance for the fisheries sector and then help countries in applying it. Next slide, please. This guidance that we're in the process of developing has two parts. The first part is focusing on what you need to know before you start an OECM assessment, including background information on the CBD decision, on OECMs where the definition and criteria are listed, the types of area-based fisheries management measures that could be considered, the data to be collected, a screening tool, and discussion of opportunities and challenges in the fisheries sector. The second part will be more of a how-to guide for undertaking an assessment. This will include steps for undertaking an assessment, suggested expertise to be involved, how to interpret the criteria and terminology in the fisheries sector, options for recognizing and reporting OECMs, and best practices for monitoring OECMs. Next slide, please. These guidelines will be developed and tested through a series of shared learning workshops, including here in the Mediterranean. These workshops will have these following objectives. They will be designed to support countries and fisheries-related bodies at regional and national levels in the application of the CBD criteria for OECMs, to help synthesize and understand the challenges, opportunities, and needs that arise in identifying fishery-related OECMs, and also to share lessons learned and recommendations from country experiences in the application of the criteria and decision. And lastly, to solicit country expertise to help shape our guidance for the fisheries sector so that we can produce a document that is really helpful for countries all over the world, not just in any one region. Ultimately, we're aiming for these workshops and the guidance that we're preparing to help countries in the fisheries sector. That's really the goal here. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague from GFCM, who will review how this is all related to area-based management in the Mediterranean and how they're approaching this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amber. And now, Betulla, Elisabetta, MORELLO from GFCM. Est-ce qu'on peut passer à la dernière présentation, s'il vous plaît, la 4?
Thank you, Imen. Good afternoon. I'll wait for the presentation to be up. So in the meantime, I can introduce myself. My name is Betulla Morello. I'm Fishery Resources Officer at the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean. And for those who don't know, the GFCM is a regional fisheries management organization for the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And our objective is to federate efforts of countries towards the conservation and sustainable use of living marine resources at all levels. So, here we go. So that's kind of, if you could go to the first slide, that would be great. So basically, the GFCM plays a critical role in fisheries governance in its area of application, and it has the authority to adopt binding recommendations for conservation and management. So that's good. I took the opportunity to introduce the GFCM. Next slide, please. So this presentation is going to be divided into 3 short parts. The GFCM 2030 strategy, we'll see what that is. The GFCM work on spatial management measures, and then the work in collaboration with the FAO Fisheries Department on OECMs. Next slide, please. So the GFCM work in fisheries in 2017-2020 was generally guided by a strategy called the Midterm Strategy towards the sustainability of Mediterranean and Black Sea fisheries. And this was a 3-year commitment of our countries and contracting parties in addressing the main priorities identified. Recently, the GFCM has gone a little step further, adopting a 10-year strategy, which provides the strategic vision for our work at a regional level. So this strategy is has 5 targets that each touches on different areas of our work. Target 1, which is the target I will go into more detail, is on fisheries and ecosystems. The target 2 is on compliance and enforcement. Target 3 includes aquaculture. Target 4 touches on livelihoods, and target 5 is on capacity development. So each target has a number of outputs, which each of which is supported by specific actions. And ingrained in all the targets is a cross-cutting theme, is the need to empower stakeholders and engage them in the decision-making processes. Next slide, please. So in particular, of particular interest today is target 1 of the strategy, which is on fisheries and ecosystems and aims at achieving productive, sustainable fisheries and to contribute to ensure a healthy ecosystem. In this context, the strategy has dedicated an output to strengthening efficient area-based conservation measures, technical and nature-based solutions towards conserving biodiversity and enhancing the productivity of marine living resources. Next slide, please. So within the actions of this output, we are expecting to establish effective area-based measures to minimize and mitigate impacts on vulnerable species, sensitive habitats, and essential fish habitats to meet international spatial conservation targets. and to assess through adequate monitoring plans the efficiency of area-based measures, in particular fisheries restricted areas. We will see what they are in the next few slides, in contributing to the sustainability of fisheries and the conservation of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Okay, so in particular, the detailed action plan for output 1.3 foresees the establishment of a roadmap for the determination of new protected areas, such as fisheries restricted areas, and or other effective area-based conservation measures, based on the mapping of essential fish habitats and vulnerable marine ecosystems, as well as based on the best available scientific knowledge. So this is kind of the backdrop provided by the new strategy, which we will, well, the countries will be working on in the next 10 years. So next slide, please. And just as an example of the vulnerable habitats that GFCM aims to protect by means of spatial protection measures is Antipatella subpinnata, for example, that can form extensive ecosystems with large associated biodiversity, and also include many fish species that find shelter, food, and reproductive places there, but will then become commercial species. Next slide, please. So I'd like to showcase the main tool we have for spatial management within the GFCM. So I would like to introduce you to the GFCM fisheries restricted areas. These were defined by the GFCM Scientific Advisory Committee in 2007, and they are geographically defined areas in which all or certain fishing activities are temporarily or permanently banned or restricted in order to improve the exploitation and conservation of harvested living aquatic resources or the protection of marine ecosystems. Next slide, please. So a fishery restricted area can be established for two reasons, or a combination of the two. So to protect marine ecosystems or sensitive habitats from potentially significant adverse impacts, and or to enhance the productivity of marine living resources, including in the deep sea. So there are two main kinds of fisheries restricted areas, VME, fisheries restricted areas, and essential fish habitat oriented fishery restricted areas. So in 2005 already, the GFCM was a pioneer in establishing a large deep sea FRA encompassing all the seabed below 1,000 meters depth, and prohibiting bottom trawling below that depth. 8 other fisheries restricted areas were established since, so between 2006 and 2020. And in the most recent annual session of the GFCM in November 2021, there was a new FRA established in the Southern Adriatic Sea. New management measures were implemented in an already existing FRA in the Gulf of Lions, and the Jabuka Pomo Pit FRA in the Adriatic was made permanent. Next slide, please. So this is a map that shows where they are, and the different colors show what the aim is for that FRA. So for example, I mentioned the Gulf of Lions, we have it here. You can't probably, oh, you can't see. Anyways, top left is the Gulf of Lions in blue.
Betulla,
yeah.
I'll ask you to pause, please, because we're having a problem with the projection in the room.
Okay.
And we have a black screen.
So no, I can't see it. I can see it. I was going on because I can see actually my presentation.
No, it only happened on this slide. We could
follow
you up until this slide, and it just happens as it is a map that we can see. So bear with us. The problems of being live are not. We may need to restart our. There is a problem of connection. I think the cable has an issue.
We're not used to live problems anymore.
Yes.
We have all sorts of other problems, like speaking when you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Merci. Non, j'ai parlé trop tôt.
Uh,
I spoke too soon. Okay.
Okay.
Yes. No.
Cool. So you have a map here of all the fisheries restricted areas, and the different colors show their main objectives. So the green ones are fisheries restricted areas whose main objective is related to protecting the MEs, while the blue ones are those mainly devoted to enhancing productivity in certain areas in essential fish habitat and protecting essential fish habitats. So one thing that you can go and consult this map. I've included the link at the bottom. But one important thing happened in 2019 was that the importance of establishing proper scientific monitoring plans to assess the effectiveness of existing and future FRAs was recognized and recommended to the Scientific Advisory Committee, which kind of took it in, and we'll see that one of the FRAs actually has an extensive monitoring plans, but above all, this has been recognized formally this year in the most recent GFCM commission. Next slide, please.
The same technician that changes the slides is trying to fix the cable. So bear with us.
I can also keep talking because the next slide is not.
You can keep talking.
Yeah, it's not really important to do. Anyways, the next slide you will see provides two very specific examples of FRAs, and we've chosen one that aims mainly at protecting essential fish habitats and another on VMEs. So the Pomo Pit FRA in the Central Adriatic Sea was established in 2017 with the objective of protecting important essential fish habitats of demersal bottom-dwelling fishery stocks, such as European hake and Norway lobsters. It's actually considered an example of best practice in transnational cooperation and in the integration of the views of stakeholders in its implementation. And it's the first to be accompanied by a comprehensive scientific monitoring plan. And the preliminary results of the monitoring plan have showed positive effects, which have included increased abundance of key commercial species, but also of other species such as elasmobranchs. And importantly, in November 21, it was made permanent with a prohibition to fish for both small pelagic and demersal resources in the core areas in certain times of the year. I think it's the slide before the one we're seeing. So if you could go one back, there you go. And here you can see, probably not very well, the evolution of fishing activities. This is just to show that it's actually being effective and, let's say, complied with. So going from top left square across to the right, we see that before the FRA, fishing was everywhere. And after the establishment of the FRA, depending on the time of the year, fishing was not taking place in certain areas of the protected, let's say, zone. The other one I'd like to show is the Bari Canyon FRA, always in the Adriatic Sea, and it has just been, let's say, adopted, and it covers 1,000 kilometers squared of an area which is characterized by VMEs. And its objectives is to contribute to sustainability of fisheries by protecting a deep sea vulnerable marine ecosystem. And this too will be accompanied by a monitoring plan. Next slide, please. And I think it's also my last one. No, second to last. So the lesson learned are that GFCM FRAs are useful spatial management measures, especially for deep sea areas. They're relevant. The process to propose a FRA to GFCM is relatively simple, though the final establishment entails full endorsement of the GFCM countries. To ensure conservation of Mediterranean rich biodiversity, new deep sea areas should be identified and protected from the impact of harmful human activities. And this is included within the GFCM strategy, and there are resolutions that have been adopted towards enhancing and providing, let's say, the guidance towards new FRAs. And the final lesson learned is that GFCM fisheries restricted areas could be good candidates to be recognized as OECMs due to their contribution to conservation of deep sea areas and resources, but also due to their technical characteristics such as monitoring plans and the fact that you can gauge their effectiveness against targets. And then the final slide, please. So the GFCM has taken all that it has in terms of tools and has increased its interest in the potential use of OECMs in fisheries through participation in several international fora. And following this, the concept of OECM was presented this year throughout our advisory process to our countries, to the CPCs. And they have agreed to work on OECMs, which have therefore then been included explicitly in the GFCM 2030 strategy. So as a first step towards this work, a webinar and a workshop on OECMs are being organized for Mediterranean and Black Sea experts and administrations as part of the regional workshop series that Amber kind of described in her presentation. So the webinar is, the first approach is going to be a webinar which is scheduled on 14th of December online in the morning, and you can register for it at the link I've included in the slide. And it will be followed by an expert meeting or workshop, which is scheduled for February 2022. And the events are open to all GFCM stakeholders, well, to everybody, but in particular, it's designed for national administration and environment and fishery managers from GFCM countries and research institutions active in area-based management. So I think with that, I've finished. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Betulla and Amber. Also, I would ask participants here to do a round of applause. That was very helpful and very interesting also to see the data and the particular case studies that you have presented on the potential OECMs within the Mediterranean. I'll now open it for discussion, and if we can have the participants in the room, and I'll ask that we also have the chat. Si on peut ouvrir la fenêtre de chat. Comme ça, on peut monitorer ce qui se passe. And we sometimes, it's very difficult for those of us who have been diving into OECMs for the past few months and really getting into the weeds of this, to take a step back and see or moderate. And I certainly don't want to guide the session in one way or another. So we thought we could have a few moments to just air any questions you may have. And these could be, what do you think about OECMs in the Mediterranean? I know that there are some tensions sometimes, and how they're going to be seen or how they can contribute to the overall network. What are your thoughts? Where do you see some opportunities? Where do you see challenges? What are your key questions now that you've heard a little bit of this? And that could be online as well as here.
Thank you very much for all these presentations. David de Montbrison. I'm from BRL Engineering Consulting Office. One question is, do you mean that all the deep seas that are below 1,000 meters of the Mediterranean will be OECM? So if yes, This means that we reach a nice percentage in the future. And the other question is the offshore wind industry is developing with floating device. And so talking about the next 10 years, there will be some example in south of France, probably in other countries. And it means a large surface that will be not available for trawling. And it's not at 1,000 meter depth. So this represents an interest for no-take zones, and a large part of it is not impacted. I'm working quite a lot on environmental impact studies of these offshore wind farms. And so it represents a nice mutual interest to develop information to these sectors that does not really know what means OECM.
Monsieur le technicien, s'il y a moyen d'augmenter le volume pour le Zoom, ouais. Merci. So I hope you can guys hear us better now with the volume. Great. I'll take these two questions. Just let me see if we can have a round of one or two others, and then we can take them in block. And I'm monitoring the chat. If online participants have questions in the chat, I don't see other hands. Charles. I'll do that later. We'll keep the last 15 minutes as to recommendations for the roadmap. Did you wanna? Yeah, but I think now they're hearing better. Oh, they couldn't hear Charles. Charles said, thank you. Charles asked if we wanted to dive into the roadmap, and we'll dedicate the last 15 minutes of the session to have discussions on actions and recommendations for the roadmap. So, Betulla, did you want to talk about if the entire FRA that is below 1,000 meter is an OECM?
Thank you, Imen. That's a big that's a big question. So for sure, it's a FRA, meaning that it's the whole area is banned to bottom trawl fishing. So this is what we have at the moment within the GFCM. What I think needs to be understood is if FRAs, and if yes, which FRAs could be considered fisheries OECMs. And I think, I mean, in the specific case of the 1,000 meter FRA, I think that could kind of raise issues as to how do you monitor the effectiveness of that OECM, for example. Whilst fisheries restricted areas such as the Pomo Pit FRA in the Adriatic has a structure that really lends itself to, let's say, ticking boxes of the OECM guidelines. So I'm not sure I can actually, I don't think we were proposing anything here today. We were just putting forward the main tool that the GFCM has to do spatial management of fisheries as a possible kind of starting point for discussing OECMs, fisheries OECMs in the Mediterranean. I'm not sure I completely answered your question, but no, that's my first take.
That's a good one. And I think this is why the criteria, and we really didn't want to dive into the technicalities of the criteria. So we have the 4 criteria: that it's not a protected area, that's managed and governed, and that produces sustained long-term biodiversity outcomes. And one can ask, what the heck does that mean? You know, sustained long-term biodiversity outcomes, and what level of biodiversity outcomes? It is just conserving one species, or does it have to have the integrity of the ecosystems? How do you consider adverse impact if in certain sectors we're going to have potentially adverse impact? That comes to your second question about the wind farm. And I think that is the interesting part of the CBD decision, that each area needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I think Betulla have in her presentation, not all FRAs are equal, and you may not have the data, and they don't necessarily all have the same management or enforcement or outcomes. And I think it would be interesting in any case as an exercise to take the 1,000-meter FRA and see, does it meet the criteria? Because then sometimes, as Amber has said, it could meet a large chunk of the criteria, but it still needs some improvement to be considered as OECM. And could there be conservation measures that could be added to that so that the area becomes an OECM? And so I think for now, we're just playing with the opportunities. To your question about the wind farm, last week we had a very interesting webinar in the Baltic Sea area, and that they're also looking at wind farms. And I think as they're going to have their workshop in February, they want to have a case study, because then the question is, how do you deal with cumulative biodiversity impact, adverse impact? And is the balance positive or negative at the end? And these are important questions that, this is what we talked about when we said threshold. You know, where do you put the bar? And what do you consider OECM? So the gentleman asked first, and then we'll.
Just Ivenok from Plan Bleu. Just one comment about what has been said just now. If I well understood, if I'm not wrong, we're talking about below 1,000 meters. We're just talking about bottom trawling. Is that right? Yes. So in that case, I think, okay, we have to discuss about the criteria, but it would be too easy to say, okay, we have a big FRA all around the Mediterranean or in the middle of the Mediterranean. And then we know that, well, the most sensitive and areas are the canyons, and where reproduction is taking place. The fisherman knows that very well. So we got a problem there regarding the criteria of OECM. If we don't consider all the canyons of the Mediterranean, there was a scientific paper just published, some weeks ago maybe, about the canyon, I don't remember his name, in the Bay of Palermo, where, it has been observed how much, bottom trawling is still damaging and changing completely the dynamic of the sediment, the sedimentology in these canyons. So here, yes, I think that should be one of the criteria we should retain for OECM in the future.
Well, I think one of the criteria is the biodiversity value of the area. And I think, you know, we need to map. One of the things that we did with the Algerian and Moroccan example is that we mapped these OECMs, overlaid them with key biodiversity areas to see, do they present biodiversity values? But to your point that an area only has one measure that is, okay, it only restricts bottom trawling. This triggers, when I said earlier that the OECM discussion triggers similarities or questioning marine protected areas, well, you have marine protected areas that only protect turtle nesting beaches, and how effective that is to biodiversity conservation. You know, I think that it's interesting to go into the criteria and say, if we apply it here, well, they should equally apply to marine protected areas.
Yeah, again, David de Montbrison, this is what I wanted to say, is that you have different level of MPA with different level of protection. So why not having different level of OECM first, and which would be more legible for people that would look at the relation between OECM and protected areas. And then why, if you don't have this, why really not considering this 1,000? Because trawlers have a large impact, so why not considering it? If you are considering oil and gas as an area of OECM, why not considering offshore wind farms that are much less impact? So this is a bunch of questions, and to have a really a screening of level is probably one of the big target of OECM.
Yeah, I agree. I see a question in the chat or comment from Tundi. And Tundi, can I ask you to please take the floor, because it's too small for me to read and we need this to be interactive anyway.
Uh-oh, that would require that I remember my comment because I can't see it also. So I was just saying that David's comment earlier about the deep sea FRA raises a more general kind of question and challenge for all of us as we consider both MPA coverage and also MPA plus OECM coverage and trying to meet the 30 by 30 goal. And that is, you know, how we deal with the three-dimensional nature of the sea and what that coverage actually means. So if we were to go through the process and look at the criteria and the indicators and determine thresholds and decide that the deep sea FRA is actually a legitimate OECM, that would indicate that the whole of the Mediterranean is in some way protected, at least the whole of the Mediterranean that is deeper than 1,000 meters. And how that would show up on a map and how that would be considered by policymakers is a challenge, because the two-dimensionality, the way that we normally deal with this and the way that we evaluate progress towards targets is generally two-dimensional. And that obscures both real progress, such as the deep sea FRA, which is, you know, as David just, I think your name is David, is that correct? Yeah, I don't know.
David. Yes.
Okay, good. As you just pointed out, David, that is stopping the bottom trawling is actually undoubtedly, arguably a biodiversity outcome, an important one. So by not including the deep sea FRA as a possible OECM, we would potentially miss the opportunity to point out that very important biodiversity outcome. On the other hand, the two-dimensionality also obscures the constraints to progress, because there are parts of the three-dimensional marine environment that are currently not being protected, such as the mesophotic zone. So I just throw it out there. I don't want to complicate the discussion, because the discussion needs to be targeted on OECMs and the potential for considering them when thinking about the roadmap for the Mediterranean. But this question of how we deal with 3D is an important one going forward, no matter what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. And we have a good example with now the deep sea minerals and all the environment, well, just the environmental plan, which is developed now in the Clipperton area in the Central Pacific. And the problem we have is that, okay, we're talking about the bottom protection and bottom protected areas, but what about, as you said, what about the water column and the surface, the 3 dimension of the MPA or OECM, as and I think it's why I reacted just before, because great, of course, it's great to have this ban of bottom trawling below 1,000 meters in the Med, but there is then the water column, and what we're going to do, I mean, to make that, from the ecosystem point of view, I mean, to make that really significant, talking about MPAs or talking about OECM, whatever, but we have to make something that is ecosystemically significant. Otherwise, I think we missed the target.
Well, one can argue that we're still not on the target, particularly if you see that many of the large marine protected areas that have contributed to the race toward the 10%, you know, if you take the case of the Hawaiian Papahanua Maluakea, the water column is not protected, and still, that has added, perhaps 1% to its alone to the ocean protection. So I think that this is what I was speaking to earlier. It's about, we have the quantitative target has been useful in getting action, but it also had some side effect, that it is a race to a number, and that the quality has to be equally accompanying that number. One of the best things I see from the OECMs is that it is forcing this discussion, because what gets into an OECMs or not is also making us look at the marine protected areas and say, well, they also have to be at the same level so that we have a similar threshold. We have 15 minutes, and I'm not sure if there are other questions online or comments that people may want to just speak, because I can't see hands. If there are any intervention, otherwise I would like to force you a little bit to think about potential recommendations for the roadmap, because I believe this is an important component of the post-2020 Mediterranean strategy. It's going to be an important component of the post-2020 targets in any case globally. And how do we treat it within the roadmap? It's already there in the strategy, but the roadmap as an enabling tool for implementations, are there specific actions that we would like to call for or reinforce? Is that what you want from us, Charles? Or
yeah, thank you, Imen. Right, so the main focus for these discussion sessions should be on the roadmap. So what are specific ideas you have for actions, indicators, partnerships to achieve the specific recommendations? But as Imen noted, there is no recommendation on OECMs. So I guess the first question to ask is there a specific recommendation where you think this fits in well? And if so, that could be modified to note the idea of OECMs. So for example, recommendation 1.1, if you pull open your computer and look at the draft roadmap, you can see recommendation 1.1, which says to ensure, and this is in strategic objective 1 on policy and governance. And so recommendation 1.1 says to ensure in each Mediterranean country national government commitment in preparing, implementing, and updating a national strategy and an operational national action plan in order to achieve international targets related to MPAs. Currently, the world is changing, and we're not just talking about protected areas, we're talking about protected and conserved areas to incorporate the idea of OECMs. So one way to modify the roadmap would be to change the language in this recommendation. So it's not just about MPAs, but it's about protected and conserved marine areas. And then that opens it up wide enough to include OECMs. And then in the actions, there could be specific things about national plans, also on OECMs, national processes like Imen mentioned, to figure out what is an OECM in this particular country. Or this could also be done regionally if countries are willing to agree on that, which maybe they wouldn't. I think maybe in many cases they wouldn't. So it's probably better at a national level. So that's just my 2 cents, some specific concrete recommendations. Maher, I hope you got some of that. I can pass it on to you.
David, and then Robert, please intervene, because we have this.
Thank you. Well, one of the, I don't know if it's a recommendation 1.1, but there's one proposal that was made by Amber in her presentation, is that, well, the recognition of the GFCM FRAs as an OECM. I was even surprised that, well, the GFCM FRAs are not recognized yet as OECM in the roadmap, I mean. So I think that's really something that should be considered and I wish adopted. And behind, I think the background, it is really about the relationship between the Barcelona Convention, that is environmental protection, with the different sectors of activities at sea. And GFCM, of course, representing fisheries, is one of the main player, regional player. And we are always talking about this, say, articulation or collaboration between these regional organizations. It's not there yet. And the proof is that, well, still the GFCM FRAS are not recognized by OECM in the MPA, in the MPA roadmap of the Barcelona Convention. And I think that's a real, very important point, regionally speaking, not nationally maybe, but regionally speaking.
Anyone online wants to react to this? Otherwise, I have more comments here. I do want to hear from Robert Turk. I will put you on the spot. Sorry. Oh, okay. We're waiting for you here, Robert. No.
I tried, Robert. Yeah, based on my comments, I would say that it's hard to inform, convene, except fisheries that are already online with these directions, other sectors to understand what means OECM and how they can contribute. If it's not clear, if the different categories of OECMs are not defined, and if the 10 years will be 10 years of discussions on how this is OECM or this is not OECM, and if in the conservation community also it's not clear, it's not easy. So I propose to have a recommendation to establish this OECM with the same criteria of MPAs. So you have a no-take zone that are high level, and you or no, how you say in English? I forgot. Complete protected zones, fully protected areas, and you have category 5 and 6. So this would be interesting to develop with at least 1, 2, or 3 sectors, including fisheries, in order to bind people from the conservation, people from these other. So this would be one recommendation. And the second one would be to promote this OECM to other sectors in order for them to get more involved, and then to spread this capacity of spreading the number and reach the targets, and not based only on conservation people. And then specifically on wind farm, again, this would be to really be close to them, because they would be for sure some of these categories, including no-take zone or high protected areas in these concessions of wind farm, that could be out of major impacts and would be protected areas. That would be interesting in terms of marine spatial planning and developing OECM.
I think that is interesting, and that warrants more. These we call them ancillary OECMs, is that they're de facto kind of protected, but then you could argue the same for military sites. You also have to look at the adverse impact that they are producing. Military sites that also have military exercising or potentially testing of weapons, then, you know, and it's even more difficult for military sites because you have no data and there is a lot of secrecy as to what happens in the sites. So are we going to consider them as de facto OECMs if we cannot kind of evaluate them? So I think some of the guidance on how do we go around evaluation, and my apologies with my back to the camera, is going to be interesting. And one of the things with the AGEM group is, you know, really thinking about how do we provide guidance within a Mediterranean context, and talk more about this. We have that partly in the strategy, but Charles left the room. I think when you look at the roadmap, it's only MPAs. And in some cases, it is MPAs, and in other cases, anything that needs to be MPAs and OECMs need to be changed to MPAs and OECMs. And I think we can do that easily. Jump in, Tundi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Just on that point, Imen, I think it's critically important to acknowledge that a lot of the potential OECMs are generating the kind of level of information and data that other, for even marine protected areas don't, and that there are parts of the strategy with the specific recommendations where the idea of actually having the OECM presence kind of enhance what is trying to be achieved with the roadmap it could be possible. So for instance, recommendation 3.1, which I'll just read quickly: develop or update management plans for each MPA that includes at least SMART objectives, integrated and site-specific management measures with a zoning plan, monitoring plan with well-defined indicators, business and financial plans, stakeholder engagement strategies, and strategies to manage, mitigate, and adapt to supra-MPA challenges. So thinking about the big picture, the ways that OECMs, if established, could help, for one thing, help address these supra-MPA challenges. So thinking about the management efficiency or efficacy of whole systems as opposed to individual MPAs, which is a desired objective of the roadmap, but the steps to achieving that I think, need to be worked on somewhat. To really think about how OECM involvement or registry could actually help enhance the effectiveness of both marine protected areas in the Mediterranean and these additional area-based management measures. So, particularly the fisheries OECMs are generating a lot of good data that could be used to monitor progress, to understand true biodiversity outcomes, to monitor trends in pressures and threats in ways that marine protected areas, given the capacity of many MPAs in the Mediterranean, the very limited capacity to do research and to generate good monitoring data. The idea of kind of looking to this corollary system of area-based management measures that are OECMs to help build our understanding of what is going on and to actually enhance the efficacy of MPAs along with that, I think should be somehow incorporated into the roadmap. There are a lot of recommendations where it could be tweaked, but I think 3.1 is one where you could specifically mention OECMs in there. Just a suggestion.
Okay, thanks. Robert, finally, I see your hand.
You asked for it.
Yes, yes, we're happy to see you.
Good afternoon to everyone. I don't think I have much to add. I would say, I mean, this OECM issue, well, it's ahead of us and there will be a lot of discussion on it, certainly. What I wanted to say is that the roadmap, it is in fact the MPA roadmap. So I think that the real place for discussing OECMs is the strategy and maybe to a lesser point, the MPA roadmap. It is, of course, I agree with Tundi. It is, of course, it can have a place, let's say, in the roadmap, but the true discussion will go through to the strategy. That's how I think, because the MPAs in themselves, they have, well, let's say, really a lot of challenges that should be solved as soon as possible. And I think that the MPA roadmap should really concentrate on that. That's my comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. This is Charles. How are you doing? we're missing you here. I just stole the microphone from Imen to respond to this, because I think your comment is very good, that this is a marine protected areas roadmap. On the other hand, we are here to define what this roadmap is about. So it doesn't have to be limited to marine protected areas. If we're following the 30 by 30 target for the CBD, which goes outside of the bounds of marine protected areas, I think we should consider whether this roadmap should also do the same. So I think I'm certainly open to that, and I think it's a discussion that we need to have, but it starts in this room, which is why I came to this session, because I thought it was an important concept that we need to bring into the roadmap, or not. And I would suggest we do.
Can I suggest, like, as a potential compromise, because I do understand Robert, and I was struggling with it myself, also because throughout this process, a lot of the constituency with which this roadmap has been discussed is mainly MPA managers. And what you have in the actions are really actions that are targeted at the site level. Most of them, I don't want to say missing the big picture, but most of them are focusing on the details. So there are only few that are really at the big picture level. And that's okay, because most of the constituency is the MPA managers. I think recognizing perhaps OECMs, I would not so much struggle to put them in specific actions, but perhaps recognize that we're going to have a new kid on the block. And that perhaps a specific strategic objective that focuses on OECMs, recognize it in the target. And my question to you, is there space for that? Maybe the best way to move forwards, that we have some of the elements that we talked about, the need, they are the opportunity and the need to enhance partnerships, but not the way in talking with other sectors, but not the way we do it with marine protected areas, that we need to bring them in. This is about recognizing the effort that these sectors are making, and not that we want to bring you within a closed line that we have called MPA. And so I think that there could be some options there.
Well, I would be, well, from what Robert said, I would be much in, and well, Charles, what you said, much in favor of well, including the OECM clearly in the roadmap. And well, we have, from a strategic point of view, what you said, Robert, strategic objective 3, as it was said, proposed before, could be ensure MPA and OECM and OECM management structures. Because, well, we can see, for example, the GFCM phrase, are managed. It's not just, well, you know, banning, well, a fishery activity, but it's managed. There are data. There's a real monitoring of the sites. So I think it could be there, as it was proposed, ensure MPA and OECM management structures, etc. And then to come up with a recommendation, a specific recommendation. So one more, I don't know, after 3.1 bis or something like that. But well, anyway, a specific recommendation regarding OECMs, I think. That would be my suggestion.
I need the mic.
Oh, sorry, this one, not this one.
Thank you. I'm just, Robert, do you want to take the floor again? Yes, please.
Yeah, I would just like to continue. In fact, it could be, well, a recommendation could be that the phrases are looked one and the other and so, and see what is missing in terms of criteria that are stated for, and that could be something to do absolutely on the way, and could be added to this recommendation as it was said. Thanks.
So I think there is a bit of consensus that we need to look at this. I think what I'm hearing is there are specific objectives that could be tweaked a little bit, or where we need to look at. They are applicable to both MPAs and OECMs. And Charles, we may give us 5 minutes to look at it when we open the entire document and tell you which ones. And then you know, the entire roadmap is going to be talked about in some sessions, so we can, this is not the only moment to contribute to that, right? But I also think that there is value of perhaps adding either a strategic objective on OECMs or some specific actions that are standalone on OECMs. And we'll try to capture from what we've had in the report today to how best formulate that to the first session on the roadmap is this evening, right? So we can try to work them out with the rapporteur and then bring them and see it, you know, so that other people could see them and contribute. It's we're already 5 minutes behind the time here. So I wanted to stop for a second and see if anyone from the online group wanted to take the floor. No, otherwise I wanted to thank really everyone, particularly Amber and Betulla. Thank you. These were really great presentations and great to see the potential of the fisheries area-based management measures and the potential particularly of the FRAs. Yes, Betulla, please go ahead.
I just wanted to react to all the positive comments on the FRAs. I guess this is exactly what we will be trying to do in the next steps of the work with FAO fisheries, is to go through and discuss the FRAs and see what, you know, what they do with respect to the criteria. So if you're interested, please join.
Join the webinar.
Yeah, start with the webinar and then we'll see.
And the link are shared, the presentations are public, so we can share the links for that. I'm mindful that some people need to move to the Novotel, so I don't want to hold you further. Thank you everyone for coming and for joining us. We'll be seeing you in other sessions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone.